I could see raids going at a variety of coastal facilities. There's been some talk about targeting Pickaxe Mountain.
We'll be hitting that area probably pretty soon, and very heavily.
Which would be psychologically debilitating to the Iranians.
Honestly, they haven't seen anything yet. We've been nice. We've been nice.
Well, we're seeing a gradual escalation of what's going on. Obviously, the U.S. is doing a lot of strikes in Iran, hitting coastal facilities. They've gone as far in as hitting around Tehran, hitting a number of different things, not just hitting. Obviously, hitting a lot of the things are directly used by Iran to target ships in the Strait of Hormuz, but also going after that supply chain, those major supply routes leading into places like the big port city, Bandar Abbas, which sits there right on the strait, hitting a number of bridges, dropping those bridges, basically stopping the Iranians' ability to resupply some of their coastal units. So that's a little bit of a shift that's taken place there. Of course, on the other side, we've seen the Iranians and that's kind of where it kicked off. Continue to target ships. They just targeted ships again this morning, and then of course hitting a variety of different types of targets, saying they're going after U.S. military bases, which they did, and that caused some U.S. casualties, which is very much in the news and discussed. But also hitting things like power plant and this desalination facility in Kuwait, which is a different target set, and they're going after critical infrastructure. And one of the things that we have to remember is that when you look at the Persian Gulf and these big cities like Kuwait City, Manama and Bahrain, Dubai, Abu Dhabi, there's no big freshwater rivers that feed into these cities. There's no Thames that rolls into Dubai. What there is there's some wells. If you get up around, in the UAE, they have some mountains, so there's some groundwater. But for Kuwait City, 90% of their water comes from desalination. So these plants are all, for the most part, along the coast. They were not designed to defend against ballistic missiles and drones, so they're vulnerable, and that's causing a lot of concern with the Gulf states. So far, the Gulf states have stayed in a defensive stance. Although if these cities are threatened with their very existence by going after desalination plants, power plants, and other things, that could change. And of course, the other thing that's happening is the Houthis, who've been kind of sitting on the sidelines, have now said they're doing a naval blockade of Saudi Arabia, which is kind of interesting considering A, it's not a real country, and B, they don't have any navy, but they do have drones and they do have missiles, and they're right there next to the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. That's that critical maritime choke point that connects the Indian Ocean with the Red Sea. That's absolutely critical for any ships going in and out of the Suez Canal. So obviously they do pose a threat, but that changes a lot of things, and it kind of makes you, Saudi Arabia attacked their major airport, Sana'a, not too long ago. That was a shift for Saudi Arabia. Obviously with this and the threat of closing that strait, you may see other countries get involved in order to keep that strait open, and you may see Saudi Arabia get more aggressively engaged in going after the Houthis. So there's a lot of things going on throughout the region. Well, there's a variety of things that could happen. There's been some talk about targeting Pickaxe Mountain. That's where we believe the Iranians are trying to set up a uranium enrichment facility, maybe set up something where they can actually weaponize some of that to make nuclear devices, warheads. So that's a possibility, perhaps a big raid, or perhaps some airstrikes with some munitions that we saw not this June, but the June before. These deep strike munitions, or these deep penetrator bombs that can go in there and destroy underground facilities. That's all a possibility. Obviously, there's a lot of talk about going after some dual-use things like power plants, more bridges, things like that. But the other thing that's come up over and over again is the possibility of islands. Kharg Island, that island where 90% of the oil that is exported from Iran goes through, that's been talked about. Then, of course, we've also done strikes on Abu Musa, Greater Tunb Island, and then there's another island called Lesser Tunb, and that's obviously a much smaller island. And but these three islands the Revolutionary Guard Corps has been using Greater Tunb and particularly Abu Musa for their operations. These islands were taken by the Shah of Iran back in 1971, and they are claimed as sovereign territory by the United Arab Emirates. That opens up a distinct possibility of maybe a joint operation, or maybe the UAE alone going in there and trying to reclaim its territory. That's been discussed for many years, but I've never seen it any closer to happening than now. And then if you get closer in, there has been talk, not recent, Larak Island, Hormuz Island, those are very close to Bandar Abbas. Those are the islands that the Iranians have been using essentially as their toll booth gatekeepers for the strait, and certainly look at those. Although there's larger populations, civilian population on those islands, which means there's larger complications if something was to be done. I don't see us. We've been striking Keshem Island, that really long island that sits off the coast near Bandar Abbas, but that is such a difficult target set. I think there's like 150,000 civilians that live on Keshem. I just don't see any military action going on there, but I could see more military action, maybe potentially amphibious raids or some sort of raid type thing. And I could see raids going at a variety of coastal facilities, which would be psychologically debilitating to the Iranians, but also would definitely create a lot of questions in their mind about where and how the U.S. is going to strike next. So that would be the next step I think we'd see. And that would, obviously, that does cross that threshold. That would, at least some point in time, put boots on the ground. And obviously, Congress is going to have a lot of things to say about that. A lot of concerns that we've seen it so many times in the past, where we make that jump and then we have a tough time getting our troops out of there. Well, amphibious raids, I can't get into too much detail, but I can say we have a lot of units out there. And certainly, if you look at what a Marine Expeditionary Unit can do, we have one on station. We have another one, I believe, still in the Indian Ocean. They can do a number of amphibious raids. That's part of the package of what they bring. Also, there's supposed to be a brigade of the 82nd Airborne Division that's in the area. They could also be used for raids. And then I understand, as far as I know, we had a lot of special operations units that are in the area. So all those things, depending on the nature, the scope, whatever's being done, they can do that stuff. And how you get in there, it could be from the sea, could be from the sky. There's just a lot of different ways to get in there and do a raid. And I should mention, a raid is different from an invasion. In a raid, you're always planning to leave. It's built into the plan that once you go in there and you do whatever you're doing, you get done and you pull all your forces back. So that's the difference between a raid and, for example, things we've seen in the past where, when we went to Iraq back in 2003, by definition, that was an invasion. I mean, we went up there, that went all the way up to Baghdad. If you go back to Desert Storm, that was an offensive operation. We weren't planning on leaving. We were planning on going in there and liberating Kuwait, which we did, and which I did. I was part of that. And then, eventually the government takes over, and we still have significant forces in Kuwait. So, that's a big difference. Well, I will tell you, there's a tremendous amount of hot air being generated in Tehran. And so you have to take a lot of this stuff they say with a great grain of salt. We hear this stuff and we think it has credence, like a pronouncement for number 10. And it doesn't. These are just, they're just saying things. A lot of times they're saying things because they're so frustrated because they can't do anything. First off, the idea that they could, one of the things they have is they have ground forces, but they have no air force. All right, so they're very frustrated. In fact, what the Iranians would probably want, the Revolutionary Guard Corps, they would love to see an invasion where at least they could meet our forces on the ground. With the air war, they can't do much. They can fire missiles, try to do air defense stuff, but they really can't. They have no way of engaging in a significant way with U.S. forces. So I think what you're hearing is a member of parliament basically saying, oh, we're going to go in there and do this. Well, first off, I don't think they have the capability to do it. I don't think they get very far if they tried. I could see what would happen just the airstrikes alone on any type of maneuver unit. Plus, if they move something that could possibly move in there, we would pick up on that well in advance. The other thing is, that's an interesting discussion. Obviously, it's by a member of parliament who knows nothing about the ground. That is the area where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers roll in. I'm not quite sure what his scheme of maneuver is. He thinks he's going to pop over in Kuwait and do this. You know, it's in fact, there was an 8-year war between Iran and Iraq, and he probably needs to go back and look at the history books to see what happened there. So very interesting, but I take it with a massive grain of salt. And I imagine we're going to hear more things like that. There's lots of threats they throw out there, and a lot of it's just frustration on their end because they can't do anything else. They can't do airstrikes. They can't launch any ships to attack anything because they have no ships. Those are all gone. They do have some gunboats, but that's about it. So, yeah, you're going to hear, I wouldn't call it idle chatter, but, you know, certainly some big claims of what they might do or could do that they can't actually execute. Well, I think a lot has been achieved. I mean, there's been a lot of devastation. And to, you know, I'm not going to, you know, the White House has their way of explaining it, but the truth is there's been tremendous attrition of Iranian capabilities across the board. There's just a lot of things they just simply cannot do now. And so there's been a lot of devastating, devastating strikes on Iran. However, you're getting into that political, psychological dimension. What's going to get the Iranian regime to actually come back in earnest and start, you know, negotiating? And there's supposed to be some negotiations indirectly that may kick off today. But obviously we saw with the 14-point memorandum of understanding that the Revolutionary Guard Corps just simply couldn't abide by it, and they just kept doing strikes and basically walking all over it. So that eventually led to a point where it was clear that there was no real ceasefire or anything. That basically it was, if there was a ceasefire, we were honoring it, and the Iranians were ignoring it. So that led to a breakdown of that. The question is, at what point will things shift? Now, one of the big things it's a political discussion is what's happening in Tehran. You know, we've never seen the supreme leader is supposed to be in charge of the whole thing. We haven't seen him since the beginning of the war, since the strike that took out his father, who was the supreme leader before, and those 49 other top officials. We've only heard that he was seriously injured. We saw the 5 days of funeral procession of his father. He never showed up once. We don't know his physical condition. We haven't seen a video from him. We haven't heard from him. We don't know if he's actually doing anything. The Revolutionary Guard Corps and General Vahidi, the head of the Revolutionary Guard Corps, has been basically controlling all access to him. So it's not clear, but what it looks like is that General Vahidi, the head of the Revolutionary Guard Corps, has become a dictator, and these other officials like President Pezeshkian, Foreign Minister Araghchi, Galibaf from the legislature, they're all engaged. Galibaf leading in these negotiations that we've had, but they're not at the center of power, and whatever they agree to isn't necessarily the position of the government, because basically the Revolutionary Guard Corps, these very extreme hardliners, are actually making all the calls on what they're going to do or not do, which makes negotiating with Iran really, really tough. So hence you're seeing this push towards kinetics, because one thing we do know is that the Iranians understand force, and so you're seeing a lot of force.